ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast welcomes Michael J. Robillard, Ph.D., independent scholar and free speech advocate, and co-author of the brand new book, Don't Go to College, A Case for Revolution. And Michael Robillard, welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me. I appreciate being here.
I'd like to start here because I think it's very important, the purpose and foundation of America's earliest colleges, because it's so different than we see them today.
Yeah, certainly. I would say almost a complete inversion as to what the original purpose of academia and college was about, going all the way back to our Catholic and Aristotelian Christian foundations in Europe, which then carried over to the American college system. And that carried at least for, 100 plus years. But really, since the 60s onward, we've seen an institution that was designed to make responsible, family-minded citizens into really a set of leftist revolutionaries. And it's just gotten to really a fever pitch in the last 5 years.
I think it's important also to look at when and why things got off track. I mean, not that we can fix what happened before, but so that we don't make the same mistakes. So what happened?
So I think there's two major theories or stories out there. I'll give you both of them. So the first one is the line of thought that people will often hear from somebody like a Jordan Peterson or Peter Boghossian or James Lindsay. You know, Peterson's theory is something to the effect that when you look at whether it be the Frankfurt School and Antonio Gramsci and the Marxists of that tradition, when they realized that the theories of Marx did not come to fruition in the first half of the 20th century, then their thought was we need to rejig Marxism into an oppressor versus oppressed narrative and aim to take out the cultural foundations and cultural institutions of the West. And this is Gramsci's so-called long march through the institutions. This is really the embryonic seeds of critical theory and deconstructionism. And those seeds are planted with the express telos of trying to undermine Western civilization and the West Christian underpinnings. In the 30s, it takes hold, particularly in the 60s with folks like Saul Alinsky. And then what we're seeing now at campuses is really the inheritance of three generations now of neo-Marxist propaganda that is just getting increasingly revolutionary and destabilizing. So that's the first theory. As Roman Catholics, myself and my co-author Timothy Gordon, we locate the problem or the source of this really going back to the Enlightenment and the French Revolution and the removal of Aristotle or Aristotelian virtue theory and a notion of telos or purposeful direction to the world within the Western worldview. When that gets removed with the Enlightenment and the Reign of Terror, as we move forward and there's a removal of telos and a removal of virtue, we see now is an inheritance of the removal of that conceptual framework from the world.
So was that removal, if we follow that path, was that removal done knowingly to lead to where we are now? Were there people conspiring to undermine us, or did it just happen?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, the guillotining of 30,000 priests in France certainly didn't help matters. But I think it's also when you look at the writings of Francis Bacon and folks like that, he had a particular antipathy towards Aristotle. some of the assumptions of the Enlightenment thinkers, be it Locke or Mill or Rousseau or Hobbes or Kant, they all have a picture of the human person that is not teleological or it's not purposefully oriented. Each of those accounts, they overlap insofar as they reject the idea that man has an essential nature, or that women have an essential nature, or that the human person, or that the physical world and nature itself has a purposeful nature to it. That concept is removed from the Western worldview. What you then see is essentially a centralist universe with a lot of individuals sort of pursuing their own prerogatives, but with nothing really holding any of it together. And that starts the cracks in the dam. And now, here we are 200 plus years later, inheriting the downstream effects of that.
The book admonishes people don't go to college, but you also talk about why people do go to college or why they think about going to college. So what are those reasons?
Well, I think the reasons are very benign, and it's a narrative that we've at least inherited that seems to make sense, having come from the post-World War II era, where parents thought to themselves, well, I want my kid to have a better situation I'm in now, and what you need for that is more schooling and more credentialing, right? We need these credentialing degrees in order to get a leg up and to have economic mobility. That if-then statement, if it were true, then, you could run the cost-benefit analysis and say, okay, well, maybe it is worth plugging my ears and listening to some of this leftist propaganda that might be in the humanities. I'll ignore that. I'll get my degree and then I'll move out. Maybe it's worth the student loans, but I'm not even sure if that if-then statement's really true anymore. As we see with the millennials and the Gen X generation, we've seen so many people, with myself included, with advanced degrees, student loan debt, and then a absence of ability to translate that into anything that matters in the world in terms of real world practicality. It makes myself and Tim Gordon think that we really need to go back to the trades in terms of encouraging people to go to that instead of these degrees on top of degrees.
Michael, I have 3 children. One is of college age. The other 2 are approaching college age. I have no inclination to send any of my kids to a college in the way that I went. Are you hearing from a lot of people like me, or is that still pretty rare?
I think it's been a mix, right? So you see this huge homeschooling movement that is occurring within the K through 12 time period, right? Because parents are seeing how woke and how much indoctrination is in the public school system. What we're essentially advocating for, it's almost a 2.0 logical next step for that ethos and that generation. If K through 12 is corrupt, then most of these state schools are likewise going to be the same.
We're living here in Central Virginia, the home of the University of Virginia, and I've noticed there, as well as colleges and universities across America, that standards are being lowered. In other words, we're not letting in enough of whatever is considered to be the right type of people or the people need to be here. So instead of bringing them up, we'll let all the standards go, including a lot of the standardized testing. What does that do to the value of a college education?
That's completely correct, and we note in a lot of fine-grained detail in the book, is really waters down the meaning of what a university degree is supposed to mean. I don't know if it's even anything more now other than seeing whether or not a person can bend themselves through the hoops and the gates that are set up there. You look at people like Peter Thiel or Elon Musk. I mean, they've said things to the effect where that they would look at a college degree as not being meaningful at all in terms of hiring somebody. They want somebody who's a free thinker, who can think and be innovative and self-motivated and think outside the box. So when you look at just how watered down these degrees are, how propagandized the curriculum is, how infantilizing the ethos on campus culture is, I think future employers might actually look at these degrees as actually a hindrance and not as something that's terribly beneficial.
So there's going to be a crossover period. I'm wondering to what extent you're hearing of employers who are willing to overlook that. And some of this probably has to do with supply and demand, because employees are in such high demand right now that I think standards are being changed in that way. But do you see that as a trend?
Yeah, I think so. I think that reality and truth will have to reassert itself at some point. We can't have an entire generation of young Americans going out trying to build houses and bridges and medical technologies while thinking that everything is a social construct, or that the mathematics that they're using is racist or oppressive. At some point that bridge is going to fall apart, and people are going to be held accountable, and money is going to be lost, and time is going to be lost. So I think at some point there will be a correction. Until we start slashing the funding of these woke schools and boycotting the Leviathan, I think it's going to be somewhat of a headache until we course correct.
You have a chapter in the book called Wokeism 101. We've all heard the word woke used culturally, but you specifically focus on intersectionality. And a lot of people have heard that word, but they don't really understand it. So what is intersectionality? Right.
So intersectionality, this is the formal concept of wokeism, so to speak. This was a term coined by feminist Marxist lawyer Kimberly Crenshaw in the early 1980s. And it's essentially a theory that presumes that, well, first of all, let me state that it's completely anti-Christian and anti-individual and anti-citizen to the core. And it presupposes that individuals are essentially a cluster of axes and narratives. And we can look at a person, and if they're a female, or if they're African-American, or if they're disabled, or left-handed, or handicapped, then we can essentially go about essentially a point system of seeing how it is, all the ways in which this person is oppressed in aggregate, and then come up with a set of state policies to ensure that they are incentivized and that they get ahead of the curve in virtue of these handicaps or these intersectional features of oppression. The tacit thing here, it presumes that the persons have, they have no dignity and that they have no agency of their own, and that they're just victims. So it really encourages students on these campuses to just think of themselves in terms of just being a victim, and looking out into the world and imagining all of these completely unfalsifiable systems that are weighted against them, instead of taking personal responsibility and trying to become a fully formed citizen and adult.
You have in that same chapter a terrific quote from Noam Chomsky about limiting the spectrum of acceptable opinion. And boy, do I see that going on today in the discussions that are allowed and those that are not allowed at the University of Virginia and other places.
Certainly. Yeah. This was actually that phenomenon particularly is what made me leave academia. I was a postdoc researcher at Oxford for 4 years doing really technical philosophy. I was a military officer too, so I was doing philosophy in the space of just war theory and counterterrorism ethics and autonomous weapons. It was fun for me I could nerd out all I wanted when it came to theories of artificial intelligence or what constitutes target and killing criteria, etc. Totally welcome to do that. This is around 2018 where all the gender stuff really broke out into the mainstream, and nobody was talking about it at Oxford. And I wanted to give a talk, and my colleagues pulled me aside and they said, you can't do this. This is, we're going to lose funding. We're going to need a higher security. Why are you going out of your way to stir up all this trouble? And I wasn't, it wasn't a fight that I was intentionally picking. I wasn't courting controversy. It was just something I see it as a philosopher that it's our job to say sometimes when the emperor has no clothes. And that's what I was attempting to do. That effectively put me on the outs of that community. And then I ended up leaving maybe about a year and a half later. I hit the guardrail of acceptable discourse that Chomsky talks about.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment with our guest, Michael J. Robillard, Ph.D.
Support this podcast Online at schillingshow.com.
BorderHawk.news is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration nationalism and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.news highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border, as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.news will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.news. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
We return on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. The book is Don't Go to College. Co-author Michael J. Robillard is with us. I want to talk about the cost of college. I was talking to some young people not long ago who told me they were carrying student loan debt in the multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars for a rather pedestrian degree. It was an advanced degree, but it wasn't anything that was very impressive. How common is that, and what happens to those people?
Oh, it's exceptionally common. Right now, we're at roughly $1.9 trillion of aggregated student loan debt in the country. 2019 alone, families spent $1.6 billion on student loans to send their kids to college. In this culture of ours, we have this idea that student loan debt is somehow good debt and that that's okay to take on. We think nothing about it in terms of letting kids that are 17 or 18 sign their lives away when it comes to signing up for these loans. Yet, it's 25 or something in order to rent a car. When you look at this, what this has done, and this is something that's transcended partisan affiliations, where you see folks like AOC and the Squad and Congress really clamoring for student loan relief. And then you see folks like former Representative Madison Cawthorn saying, don't go to college at all, become an entrepreneur. I think it's encumbered an entire generation plus. Even if they get the job, even if they get the internship after the degree, really what ends up happening is that low-level job, they don't have the activation energy or the inertia to get out from underneath the accruing loan until they're in their mid-40s or 50s. And that's basic, let alone what it costs for law degrees or advanced degrees.
Yeah, and of course, you mentioned in the book that the left and the right have different approaches to solving the problem, but the approach of the left is we're going to forgive everybody's loans, damn the people who already followed the rules and paid them, and then from now on, everything will be quote-unquote free, which essentially will make the costs skyrocket, even though we won't see it directly.
It's absolutely a suicidal plan. Not only is it penalizing people that were more fiscally responsible from the beginning, but it also sets up a very dangerous moral hazard and moral precedent where, well, now that we've established that precedent, what does that mean? What, every 5 years there's going to be another Jubilee moment where all the loans keep getting absolved? So I think that's just a bad precedent to establish across the board and in so many ways.
You talk about the historical costs versus today's costs, and college has skyrocketed. Why is it outpacing all of the other areas? Because you bring up quite a few examples in the book.
Mike Rowe and Dave Ramsey. Well, Dave Ramsey has a documentary about this, and he quotes Mike Rowe of Dirty Jobs. And Mike Rowe has an excellent quote where he says something to the effect of, in America, we got it in our head somehow that the cost of college, it's priceless. And it's outpaced price of oil, price of energy, price of everything. And it's like, well, there's no commodity that's priceless. It just turns out that it's not. It's become this almost like drinking salt water effect where, the more we're drinking it, the thirstier we're getting. And then the opportunity cost that is lost with that is starting a family, of starting your own business, of just getting out of school and getting on with your life. that's another cost that gets ignored in the equation.
Yeah, it was interesting that you detailed the cost of getting a bachelor degree and kind of included everything there at around $400,000 possibly. And part of that is the work lost during those 4 years or 4+ years that the student was in college. That's never really discussed. I've never heard anybody analyze it in that way, but it's so important.
The opportunity cost really needs to be something that is considered when families and young Americans are really considering what it is that they're getting into. And then when you start looking at the fine-grained breakdown of what these universities are actually paying for, the majority of their funding, it's going to really like the HR department and this behemoth of woke administrative overhead. Insane amounts of money that are being paid to the HR departments. Also, in terms of building climbing walls and luxury dorms and 5-star dining experiences at the food court, rather than it being about education for education's sake or knowledge for knowledge's sake. They're all in an arms race to essentially sell the college experience, the resort college experience to these young Americans. And then that's where a huge amount of the money is going, in addition to tremendously overpaid deans. And then also they'll have celebrity guest professors, they'll have Elizabeth Warren or Angelina Jolie come in to teach a class about something and pay millions of dollars to those folks. So that's where the money's actually going, as opposed to actual good quality knowledge.
Parents used to send their kids to school, and maybe some of them still do today, although it's certainly not true, as a thing and an experience that would mature their children into adults. And you say it's exactly the opposite.
Exactly. As Roman Catholics, myself and Timothy Gordon, we believe that persons are purposefully ordered towards becoming adults and having families, and that the family is the foundational cell of civilization. What ends up happening is that when these folks go away to these colleges, there's the curriculum itself is a combination of radical sociosexual liberation plus an attack on the family unit as being, or the nuclear family unit in particular, as being fascist or being oppressive. So that's the curriculum that these students are getting by day, in the form of LGBT or LGBTQ or feminism of various waves. And then at night, it's Animal House on steroids. And, what ends up happening is these students end up, it's a crucible of sexual vice that students then take on with them into their 20s when they go to their jobs into their cities. And then by the time they come out the other side of that, the possibility of forming strong pair bonds and families is both habitually, ideologically, and logistically stunting.
Let's talk about some options that people can consider instead of going to college. What can they do?
That's a great question. So we're very much fans of what Mike Rowe has been pushing, and Tucker Carlson as well, and they've been arguing for a hard return to the trades. This is something that myself, in the 90s, it was somehow just assumed that we need to gut the trades out of high school education to make room for the gig economy. I think that carried over to the culture as well. So what we argued for is for folks to go into the trades and to stay local and to have families as quickly as possible, and to avoid these indoctrination centers that are just shunting Americans into these cubicle these inert cubicle lifestyles in the cities. So the trades is one big option. The other is entrepreneurship. So this is what Peter Thiel has been arguing for. He actually has a scholarship, anti-college scholarship, encouraging students to become entrepreneurs instead of going to college as well. Certain parts of the military service, I think, could work, though that is becoming increasingly woke as well. So I think people need to be selective when they're thinking about that. Those are the ones that we point to. And the main theme that we're just arguing for is that conservatives, they're not going to win. They're going to win the culture war with big families and more children, not with more advanced degrees. Our main prescription is to stay local, get in the trades, work with your hands, start a family, and get on with your life.
If people would like to get a copy of your new book, Don't Go to College, A Case for Revolution, or if they'd like to follow your work online, how can they do that?
So Regnery Publishing is the publisher, so you can go to regnery.com and you can get the book there. It's also on all major distributors like Amazon.com or Barnes & Noble or Borders. As far as my own work, you can find my other writings on michaelrobillard.com or Michael Robillard at Substack. I also have another book. This is my Ph.D. thesis that I turned into a book through Oxford University Press called Outsourcing Duty. So you can get that book as well. And that's about civil-military relations.
I hope people will take advantage of the opportunity to read this book. It is so important, and I hope that it is a cultural influencer. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.